we must implement economic reforms to create sustainable jobs and drive inclusive growth.
6 months after uttering those words, how far has President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration moved with those structural reforms? Welcome to this Wednesday edition of the Watchdog as we continue to take stock of progress on the priorities the President made in his February State of the Nation address, with a specific focus this evening on structural reforms. Earlier today, addressing an investment conference in Limpopo, the President recounted some of the progress he said has been made since that February 11 State of the Nation address.
We are undertaking far-reaching structural reforms in energy, transport, and water sectors, all of which are important for the industries with the highest potential for growth in Limpopo. We have already taken several steps to achieve security of electricity supply for the whole country. This includes the restructuring of Eskom into separate entities for generation, transmission, and distribution. This will stabilize the company's financial position and improve the performance of Eskom's power plants. We have also created the conditions for a rapid increase in the generating capacity of Eskom, of electricity more broadly, through opening further bid windows for our renewable energy program and increasing the licensing threshold for embedded generation projects to 100 megawatts. Now, these will lead to significant investment opportunities in the field of energy. And we have already received a lot of interest in this regard. As soon as we opened up to 100 megawatts, the proposals that are coming through are quite meaningful. To support industry, we continue to make improvements in the turnaround time for the issuing of water licenses. One used to wait for up to 3 years to get a water license, and we are now reducing that quite exponentially. We are also in the process of establishing a National Water Resource Infrastructure Agency. We are also increasing capital investment in our ports and freight rail infrastructure, and are making progress in increasing the efficiency and competitiveness of our ports.
President Ramaphosa there obviously chuffed with what his administration has been doing in trying to bring about those structural reforms that he has been promising over the past, in fact, for more than a year now, to help us make sense of it all, to see if they agree with him at all. Let's welcome Busi Mavuso, who is the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Professor Channing Ant is a director with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Ms. Lebohang Phego is an economist with the Trade Collective. Evening to all of you. Thank you very much for your time. I want to start with energy, the one area that gets South Africans worked up at the same time, you know, when state utility Eskom can't keep the lights on. From where the president and his economic cluster sit, Busi Mavuso, the restructuring of Eskom is going very well. Thank you very much. Do you agree?
Good evening. It is moving along, not at a pace that we'd obviously like to see, but I think let's agree that there is some progress there. So I think ESCOM has now managed to divisionalize the three entities, generation, transmission, and distribution. And all the three entities now have their different executive teams, as well as their MDs, as well as their boards, but they still report to the main board, as it were. So there is some progress in as far as that is concerned. So there is obviously going to be work that needs to be done around the legal separation, as it were, and we all agree and accept that is actually going to take a little bit of time, because then there is an issue of where the debt is going to sit. And as per the conversation that we had, as Blaine said, with the Minister of DPE, he actually confirmed that the SOE Council is actually looking at, how do we actually deal with the issue of debt, in as far as ESCOM is concerned, but then we know that ESCOM's problems, are far from being over. We saw the annual results presentation yesterday. We saw that they posted a 19 million or 19 billion loss, as it were. So it is an organization that is still highly troubled. Interestingly enough, the conversation that we should be having as a country, if you ask me, and I think this was confirmed by Minister Godongwana 2 days ago when he was addressing business, we should actually be focusing on energy security. And energy security in this country should not equal ESCOM. Because if our focus is going to be on, fixing ESCOM, then we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve. Let's stop protecting ESCOM as a country. Let's stop actually giving it, this false protectionism that it has been given. Let's allow other players to actually come into the industry. There are much more cheaper forms, of energy, that are actually being introduced. I think the lifting of the license exemption to 100 megawatts is a good step in that direction, but more needs to be done. There are more available and more efficient, energy sources that actually need to be brought in. ESCOM cannot be the solution. So if our focus is going to be on ESCOM, then we are missing the point. The focus ought to be on energy security. And that is what investors want to see. They don't care whether the energy security is going to be provided by ESCOM or not. They just want to know that they are going to be investing in a country where they are not going to experience, 4 hours of load shedding every day. That is the conversation that we should actually be accelerating as a country.
Could that then be the reason why Gwede Mantashe last week, in a reply to a parliamentary question, people thought that, he wasn't really saying what they expected him to say, because, as you know, ESCOM wants to raise, I think, about 180 billion in concessional finance as it seeks to move away from coal. And then Gwede Mantashe was saying, why are you so eager to get rid of coal? I'm not really interested in that. Could that be? Could what you've just said be the reason why you think he reacted that way?
I think the issue that we have as a country is that we are stuck on ideologies, and I think we're going to have to actually try and model ourselves around what is actually going to attract investment into the country. And I think when you look at the world over, there is less and less attractiveness, around investment in coal. So we're therefore going to have to look at what are investors, looking to invest in, because we don't have much of a choice. We are dependent, on investment. And I'm worried about ESCOM getting itself into more debt, because we know that the biggest albatross that we have as a country is precisely the ESCOM debt. So we therefore don't need to actually get ESCOM to borrow at all costs, for them to fix their generation. I mean, they've got huge problems in as far as their generation plants are concerned, So if we want further investment in coal, what are we saying? Are we saying we're going to build another Medupi and Kusile? And if that is the plan for the country, then I'm worried that we are fundamentally missing it, because the world is moving to different sources of energy. So we can't be hell-bent on coal because it is an ideology. So we have to agree that our ideologies as a country are not going to help us. We need to respond to what, investors would like to see. And let's agree, that we are part of an open, economy, which therefore means that we're not only competing with ourselves as a country, but we're competing with the rest of the world. So what, therefore, is the rest of the world doing. And that is what, good should look like for South Africa. And that is what the barometer and the measurement for our success should be, not what the ANC thinks is right.
Professor Ant, your own assessment of what is going on in the energy space. One, do you agree with the president's assertion that, the restructuring and reorganization of ESCOM is doing very well? And secondly, do you really understand what lies behind, such utterances as the one that was made by Minister Mantashe recently, saying he doesn't really understand the rush when clearly we have an abundance of coal, which he reckons we should utilize.
So I agree with Busisiwe. I think she said it very, very well. The world is moving towards different sources of energy. Here in the U.S., coal production is collapsing simply because it's not economic. And in South Africa, actually, if you look at your endowments of wind and sun, they're excellent, very good relative to the rest of the world. And South Africa really has an opportunity to move in this direction and not just provide security, but provide security at low cost. I think it does everywhere. It requires institutional reform. That's the big problem. It isn't the technology anymore. We can produce this power at low cost. We just have to make sure there's that the wind and the sun blow. The wind blows and the sun shines and it produces electricity, and we have to balance the supply and demand. This is a bit of a trick and something that we need to work on. So that's the challenge right there. But if we can address that challenge, move forward, and there are multiple ways of doing that, then you're going to end up with reliable, inexpensive power and less expensive than other places. The short-term problems in South Africa's energy sector are terrible. The long-term prospects are excellent. And it's getting from A to B that's really the big challenge. And certainly some form of institutional reform is required, and everybody I speak to is very happy with these initial steps, just like Busisiwe. So I think this is going in the right direction, and she's absolutely correct that getting the international investment in would be very helpful. I think that looking at some regional perspectives could also be very helpful. There's large hydropower reserves out there. Electricity trade is something that could smooth the generation profile, make demand make it more available, make it more reliable, and big hydropower can actually play a role in that. So there's a great deal that can be done, but I agree that the steps are in the right direction. It is a very sticky problem how to sort of work with the ESCOM issue. There's no doubt about it. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be hard. But we should also remember the fundamentals and the long-term perspectives.
Now, one of those steps, and I'm going to bring you in here, Lebohang, is the government deciding that private companies will now be able to generate and sell their own electricity up to 100 megawatts without requiring a license to do so. I want you to take a listen to what Gwede Mantashe how Gwede Mantashe recalled how that move was actually made possible.
When we had a very serious discussion with the president about these 50 megawatts, we were asked 50 megawatts. I say, why do you refuse? We asked a question in return. Why should it be limited to 50 megawatts and not make it 100? First was that question. And they asked us, why do you want 100? I say, because on my desk here, we've just given a license to gold fields of 40 megawatts. On my desk, we have three companies. One is looking for 84 megawatts. Another one is looking for 70 megawatts. Another one is looking for 100 megawatts. Ironically, all of them are mining companies. And I said, if we are opening up energy generation, why should we exclude these mining companies? It made sense, and then we agreed on putting it at 100 megawatts. So, in brief, policy formulation is not an event, it evolves. And if it is not discussed properly, it will leave a number of questions unanswered.
Gwede Mandasha there, Lohang, suggesting a number of things, among them that one, government wasn't dragged kicking and screaming into this, and that secondly, they were actually willing and able to go way beyond what the market expected at that time. Just your reading of what brought about this particular aspect of these reforms.
I think it's been already said. So the one is basically the fuel and the energy deficit that we've been experiencing in South Africa over the last 10 or 15 years, hours of load shedding. And I think that beyond that, there's also the incapacity or the very slow pace of developing the kind of infrastructure that would then enable the sorts of multiple forms of energy usage and the multiple energy grids that the colleagues have already mentioned to then come into play. So I think the transitioning out of coal, the correct reluctance to deal with things like fracking, for example. And then I think, of course, we haven't been able to harness the wind, the sun, and the rain, and all of these other things that are such an endowment in this country and, in fact, across the region. The point here is to keep the lights on, and in order to do so, the business model, and I guess the market orthodox model, is that if you have more players coming into the fore, it will potentially mean that there's greater coverage. It will also mean that the competitive environment enables price competition, which is supposedly a boon both for consumers and for producers. And lastly, it is hoped that this will then drive down the cost of production and enable, I guess, a much more predictive form of production, so that if producers and industries at large are able to anticipate what their fuel and their energy footprint is going to be, the costs of that, the frequency of that, and even the timing of that, it enables much easier business planning. I mean, I'm not per se sure whether that's exact science, but that's what I imagine has been really the lead up to all of this. And of course, yes, investor confidence and all of the things that have been spoken about previously.
Now, while, of course, Eskom is being sorted out on the one hand, and other alternative sources of energy are being brought on board, there is this idea of this floating power plant in the name of this power ships, which has been mired in controversy. Other people saying it's way too expensive for something that is supposed to be temporary. What do you make of it, Busi?
I think my colleagues have actually already indicated that we are not tapping into our natural endowments, and we haven't exhausted those options. So before we go with these radical, expensive options, why are we not utilizing that which we already have? I was having a conversation with a colleague, and they were saying that, in countries where the sun doesn't shine for 365 days a year, they actually are effectively utilizing, alternative sources of energy, like solar power. Mm-hmm. Why can't that be the focus, in South Africa? Prof has spoken about the wind, as well, which we are not in short supply of. Why are we not utilizing those sources? So, of course, this is too big a problem, for it to be solved by one silver bullet, as it were. So we agree that there isn't one solution that is actually going to deal with our energy security issues. But we are saying that there are low-hanging fruit that could actually be utilized and that could actually be exploited. And for whatever reason, as a country, we are choosing not to focus on those and look at how we can actually fully exploit those. Because what we're doing is tantamount to the nuclear deal that we actually wanted to sign about 7 years ago, whatever the case is, when Zuma was actually in office. And you're looking at that and you're saying, but why go for that, expensive option? Why want to spend money that the country doesn't have? Utilize what is already there and see how we can actually exploit it to the fullest, as it were.
Now to move to water, an area that the president touched on at that investment conference earlier today, Prof. As we know, I mean, a lot of the water boards are in a mess, while people, I mean, there's corruption, and on the other hand, water is actually not being delivered to, you know, both people and companies. I mean, companies, as the president was saying in that bite we played, at some point had to wait for 3 years, you know, just for a water license. And you can only imagine what that does to entities like, you know, mining companies. What do you make of the promises that are being made in that area, Prof?
The water infrastructure is obviously very, very important. I think, again, it's important to keep the long term in mind. South Africa and your assets, right? So we talked about very good wind and solar assets. Actually, South Africa has phenomenal water infrastructure. It's excellent internationally. And so it needs to be kept into place, especially as we head into, you know, climate change situation. The climate is going to be moving about. Rainfall is very uncertain. We don't know how exactly it's going to be, you know, it's going to go, whether places are going to get warmer or drier. It's going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter or drier. And this infrastructure that exists, especially that which can move interbasin transfers, in other words, can move water around the country, is really important for keeping business going, for making it possible for industry to have the water that it needs, as well as for planning and agriculture, where the jobs are. And so this has been a real focus for a long time in terms of trying to bring this out. I think this part of Operation Vulindlela is a really important initiative and very, very welcome. And it builds on what's being done, what's there. Now, I mean, again, it's like Eskom. There are problems here, and sorting those out are real challenges. But there's assets there in terms of what's there in terms of basic infrastructure, and real needs to move it forward. I think we're going to talk, you know, eventually, talking in agriculture, and water is going to be so important for getting agriculture going, and particularly if we're thinking about, you know, a land reform program that's going to move to smaller size operations, which would be more intensive, more labor intensive, probably higher value products, and probably products that are going to depend on a fair amount of weather, either in terms of being in very good rain-fed regions or having some form of supplemental irrigation. So that's another place that's really important for the country looking forward in terms of the growth and reform agenda, and water is a big part of that.
But do you get a sense, very briefly, just from what has been said, what is being done, that the government is moving with the same speed? I mean, earlier you agreed with Vusi that on the energy front there is significant movement, and we can all see it. Yes, it may not be as fast as we would want it to be, but there is movement nevertheless. Can you say the same around water, Prof?
I don't know if there is a public announcement of something that would make it, you know, really seem for sure that we're doing this. But you know, behind the scenes, I know they're serious. That's something that they're working on. There's part of the program, and it's a welcome part. It would be nice if they were able to point to some things. Just, you know, that's what you need to be able to do in order to show movement. You know, there may be something that I don't know about, but I do know that this is an important part of Operation Vulindlela, and Operation Vulindlela is important to the administration. So they're moving on.
Another area, Lebohang, that everyone, I mean, a lot of people have been talking about is around the auctioning of the broadband spectrum. The last time I think the president spoke about it more meaningfully, or, you know, said a bit about it, it was that the fact that it is still stuck. We're still stuck because there are these people, among them your MTNs and your telecoms, that have actually taken the regulator to court. Are you convinced, from where you sit, that the government has done the best it could to really move in this area. And I'm saying this also conscious of the fact that at some point, it was actually the Minister of Communications that actually took the regulator to court, which delayed things. But your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was about 10 years ago or more when the minister talked about what should constitute universal access and universal broadband access across all areas. And remember that we've been having this conversation in different versions over the last 20 or 30 years or 20 or 25 years. We used to call it, the digital divide, but it's really the same parameter of concerns of digital citizenship and democratization of digital access in this country, right? And the whole idea is that, and I think that this Gazette was talking about universal access to communities with communications networks and services, and also this, it's also linked to when we talk about digital citizenship and digital democratization, it does suggest that, of course, we shouldn't have a situation where in some areas you're not able to get a signal, you're not able to get a network. And I think most of us who are 1 or 2 generations away from rural areas, like my parents, the communities that my parents and my grandparents grew up in, if you go there, you need to stand on your head and do very strange tricks just to make a phone call. And when we think about how this impacts on the experience of learning, the experience of doing business, the experience of, for learners, for business people, for producers, for manufacturers, for farmers, and so forth, in all of these areas, I think it's quite clear that the pace of enabling this universalization to take place has been very petty. And I do also think that the cost of data is also another part of it. Remember also that, there's supposed to be a cap on how much data costs and all of these grids. I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, but I do know that there's certain grids and there's certain formula that all of the network operators are subject to, which is to enable access and affordability. Now, South Africa, by any standard, and I don't like saying words like global because I think those are very problematic terms. We're an African country, and I think that it is important to bear that in mind. But by any measure, compared to Mali, compared to Mauritius, compared to Kenya, which I think on the continent, countries like Mauritius and Kenya would be our peers. Compared to Ethiopia, our digital access is just quite appalling, and the cost of that access is also quite appalling.
In fact, take a listen to what the immediate past Minister of Finance had to say a couple of weeks ago here on the program as to why, Lebohang Pheko, what you've just spoken about isn't or hasn't happened in the years that we've been expecting it to.
This spectrum issue has been discussed for over 10 years. Why is it a problem? Why has it not been resolved? The reason why it has not been resolved is because there's too many fingers on the till.
Too many fingers on the till, Lebohang, is the reason the former finance minister says we haven't gotten where we wanted to go.
Yeah, I have no comment on the fingers on the till remark. I think the former minister can qualify that for himself. But I certainly do think that we need a much more coherent, cohesive way forward. And I also do think that, bodies like ICASA need to be playing a much more activist role. The licensing conditions, for example, that apply to that apply to us, especially when we to companies and to formations and to industries, demand quite spectrum. They should also enable much easier roaming facilities, much easier facilities sharing, by the way. And I mean, it's been suggested in the past that these should be cost-based, and that I think there should also be some kind of a sliding scale of cost. So I've always been of the view that, for example, domestic access to broadband cannot possibly be as high as it is for example, large industries where you have 10, 20, 30,000 people in a company where affordability and the economies of scale come into play as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure a lot of people will agree with you on that. We're going to take a quick at break. When we come back, this conversation continues. We look at other areas of the economy that needs these structural reforms that everyone says are a precondition to bringing investment and therefore employment in our country. Don't go away. Of the economy that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, but before the pandemic actually hit us, we were told repeatedly, year in and year out, that it has a huge potential. Yet the sort of things that were supposed to make that sector do for our economy what we all say it can do have actually not been put in place. And one of those things, Busi, has been the e-visa system, that has been coming for years. And nothing seems to have happened on that front.
Which is unfortunate, Vuyo. But I think just like the Prof said, I know for a fact that this is one of the projects that Operation Vulindlela is focusing on, and I'd like to think that seeing the progress that they've made thus far in terms of driving the critical structural reforms, I'm sure something like this will also, we'll see more progress being made on it quite soon. So tourism is a very critical sector for the country, obviously, because we agree and we accept as a country that the unemployment problem that we have as a country, and we saw the numbers, I think, last week, we're sitting at 44.4%, unemployment in terms of the expanded definition, 65% youth unemployment, which is a recipe for disaster, whichever way you choose to look at it. So let's therefore agree that probably maybe the formal sector has reached its limit and maybe has reached its ceiling in terms of how many people they can bring into employment. The focus, therefore, needs to be at how do we, therefore, encourage and support SMMEs, and how do we actually make sure that we have an informal thriving sector, as it were, because that is where a lot of players, in the tourism industry are actually coming from. So I think there is a lot that needs to be done, from a regulatory perspective and a whole lot of other rigidities and constraints that we have in our environment in terms of enabling our tourism sector, But I think the authority that Operation Vulindlela has coming directly from the President office, gives me confidence, that we should see some positive developments, in as far as the e-visa system is concerned.
Prof, just from your own assessment, of Operation Vulindlela, what for you are the areas that stand out where you've been able to see significant progress actually being made through this project, which in essence, is a collaboration, for lack of a better word, between Treasury and the presidency in trying to unlock the blockages we are talking about, ranging from electricity to water and a whole host of other things. But what for you, from what has happened up until now, really stands out?
One of the interesting things is all the conversation that we're having now is really sitting in the Treasury's growth strategy that they published back in August 2019. And if you go back to that document, you're looking at the water sector, you're looking at energy, you're looking at network industry, you're looking at tourism, you're looking at agriculture, and so forth. So Operation Vulindlela is an operationalization of these issues, and I think it is gratifying to see the government really move it. Developing a strategy, getting comments on that strategy. I think it is a reasonable strategy. I will say that, and moving forward on that. So I think that's all quite good. The thing that we do need to bear in mind, and Abusi just said it, is even prior to the pandemic, right? The economic performance in South Africa was terrible, The final quarter of 2019, per capita growth was negative. And this just isn't, and it had been basically declining more or less since, 2008 or 9, something like that. So there is a real need for two things, and Operation Vulnerability is part of that. The first is, we had a bad situation in 2019, and COVID has made it worse in almost every dimension. It's very bad out there right now. You're still mired in one of the worst economic sort of contractions of the century, and so there's a need to be thinking about how do we get out of this morass, this deep economic pit that we're sitting in right now, and that's sort of moving things quickly, and so that's one big agenda that's coming, and then that agenda needs to be leading towards the growth strategies that we're talking about, the reforms and so forth, in order to get to a much higher rate of economic growth that's going to supply the jobs and hopefully bring a greater level of equality. I will disagree with Pussy just on one point. We've agreed on almost everything. I don't think the formal sector is going to be out of gas. I think with the right policies, there's a lot of scope for moving the formal sector. I do think that it's extremely important that the South African formal sector is taking an international perspective to what they're doing, and that they're encouraged, and because right now we're not going to see a great deal of internally generated demand, certainly not by government, in terms of there's just not the revenues and not the borrowing capacity to be driving demand with governments. So demand has to come from somewhere, and international sources is a good way to do it. And there's a lot of possibilities getting there. Tourism, which we get back to, is one of those. Eventually, when the pandemic starts to go away, South Africa is an excellent destination. And then there's business tourism, medical tourism, all of these things that have been spoken about. But there is, and I think this show is a great part of it, there's a real need to make sure that things are actually moving and reforms are actually happening. Because if we simply go out of the pandemic into the same policy environment and institutional structures that existed in the previous decade, I don't know why we would think the performance will be better in the next decade. And the previous decade just was nowhere near good enough. So we just have to do things differently. And the strategy, there's a strategy there. You can agree with it or disagree with it. There's an operation that's going, but it needs to be pushed along.
Now, Lebohang, Eskom is, of course, not the only. Government has been talking a lot about it, and it's not difficult to understand why. But a whole host of other state-owned enterprises are on the radar screen. Reforms, are being spoken about there. I mean, the corporatization of Transnet, the ports authorities. This is an area I know you focus a lot on. There's talk of establishing a transport economic regulator, and so on. Just looking at that area, the role of state-owned enterprises. What are you seeing, or what have you seen since the president made pronouncements and started talking about the reforms that they are going to introduce there?
Yeah, thanks. So, I think the one thing is that it's not very clear, but one thing I know is quite certain is that there is possibly the possibility of equity stakes in some of the state-owned enterprises. And these are the sorts of conversations which do become quite difficult to have, because it does raise the specter of privatizing state-owned enterprises, which many people are quite uncomfortable with, including myself to some extent. The other question is of strategic foreign investments and what those could look like, who could own them. And again, that is quite uncomfortable because it does raise the specter of what should be state-owned assets having international investment in them. And the other piece of that, of course, is then what this means for job shedding or job losses. And I also think that we don't have enough conversations around what it means to rationalize SOE. So, there have been conversations in the past about how to break them up, and break them up not in a way that sheds them, but in a way that decentralizes their functions. These are often very clunky, ponderous and very old institutions. Some of these SOEs are over 100 years old, bear in mind, 50, 100 years old. They're not necessarily fit for purpose in today's context. And that's really because of, they were not really designed for today's context. They were designed for 60, 70, 80 years ago, basically as jobs/economies for predominantly Afrikaner workers. So obviously so much has changed since then. And unfortunately, what has not happened since 1994 are the modalities of running these SOEs. And I think I've said before that the other difficulty is that SOEs have not per se been able to play a much more activist role and a much more proactive role in being preeminent in the economy.
Why do you think that is?
So I think that really state-owned enterprises have a role to play, for example, in enabling, particular fixed investments in key sectors. So whether that is around nuclear energy, what that might look like, whether that is around ESCOM, what that might look like, whether it is around the way that we do flight travel. And that could mean, different job share and worker share models, which enable their, for much greater worker retention, for one thing, very different bidding and tender processes, which would then cut down a lot of the cost. There have been some very opaque and very unpalatable bidding and tender processes within some of the SOEs, which have been extremely expensive. Some of them not quite according to exact regulations, and one or two were caught just before they were being signed off, billions of rands, which potentially might have been misspent, misallocated. And I'm being very cautious with my language there, but many others that we're not aware of. But I do think that state-owned enterprises, Vuyo and colleagues and the viewers, their primary role is to be the engine for growth, for job creation, for skills development, and to really set a country ahead of its peers. That's essentially what state-owned enterprises should be. They are not supposed to be slush funds, and they certainly should not be having money thrown at them as they continue not to perform.
Mm-hmm. Now, Busi, one of the officials involved in Operation Vulindlela, who's also part of the team that has been tasked with driving this program of structural economic reforms, was addressing Parliament, I think it was last week. And one of the things that were mentioned was attracting skilled migrants. Is that, from the conversations you are having within business circles, is that a big factor? Is that a big issue?
Yeah, so, we've just come from a period where we were reviewing the critical skills list, and I think there was a lot of interest in this matter from a business perspective. And one of the issues that Operation Vulindlela, as you rightfully said, is working on is this issue of the skills visa. So I think we are mistaken as a country to think that we will attract foreign direct investment without some foreign skills that are actually going to come with it, or without some experts that are actually going to come with it. So I think let's agree that it is going to be a given that foreign direct investment is going to come with some experts, and we therefore need to look at, if we agree, as the President said today at the Limpopo Investment Conference, that our focus as a country is still on attracting the 1.2 trillion rands, foreign direct investment, then we need to look at to what extent are our processes, for enabling that investment to come in sufficient and efficient, and to what extent do they actually allow the country to can expedite the investment agenda that we've set for ourselves. If you look at the many commitments that have been made over the past few investment conferences, where you will see that a lot of them have not been banked, precisely because there are these rigidities in as far as the regulation and the legislation is concerned. So one of the skills visas, is actually one of those. So there is therefore a need, that we look at how we actually expedite this process. Am I saying that we actually need to bring experts and actually overlook, the high rate of unemployment and the local skills? Definitely not. But I'm saying that let's just accept that if there is a huge dependence on foreign direct investment for our economic revival and our economic growth, then it is going to come with some experts. And let's look at the issue of the skills visa and look at how we can actually expedite that process. Because at the moment, it is really cumbersome and it is a serious constraint to investment.
Prof, and that's usually what Busi has just alluded to. Is usually, the fear of the locals is usually that, especially now, we, from the figures Stats SA released about 10 days ago, we're facing record high unemployment levels. And so locals are going to ask, why bring a lot of people from outside when we are the ones who need the jobs, who need to be skilled? What is the international best practice? How have other jurisdictions done this while, striking the balance between all the, concerns?
So it's an excellent question and a really important policy issue, and one that I think has been raised in a lot of places. The unemployment rate amongst highly skilled and experienced people, the kind of people that can do a very large technical project of some sort, is extremely low, and it's very low everywhere. It's low in South Africa. The macro evidence is really convincing in the South African case. If you go back to 94, 95, you find that the difference between highly skilled wages, the wages of the very top earners, so the top 5%, are multiples of median wages or wages of the unskilled. And this is not surprising given the situation that you were just emerging from in 94, 95. What is surprising is that ratio went up. In other words, relative to median earners or low-skill earners, top earners have been earning more and more and more every year, and it's been that way now for 25 years. The evidence is quite strong. And this is showing, basically a very, very strong demand for that level of labor. And it's an actual constraint to growth. So having being able to tap international markets is really important, and it's one of the things that the United States does it. Have these programs, people come in, and it's a very important part of the growth process. In South Africa, that would be even more so. This is highly likely to generate jobs and not create jobs. And I think also it's important to point out that the unemployment problem is rampant among the unskilled, right? But you also have an unemployment problem now amongst basically recent university graduates or people who've recently received tertiary degrees. And the way it works all over the world is young people 23 years old don't go out and build bridges all by themselves. Mm-hmm. They work in companies with experienced people who have these engineering degrees or other things, mm-hmm. and having a certain number of highly skilled people to work with this fantastic cohort of young South Africans that you come out of your tertiary education system, such that they can be mentored, learn skills, and so forth. I think that would be positive for that level of unemployment, and I don't think it would create any unemployment amongst the top 5% of earners.
Now, Lebohang, Home Affairs, the Home Affairs Minister has come up with this critical skills list, and when one looks at them, these are actually skills, a lot of which can actually be found on the continent. But I know that often when people talk about this issue, they look beyond, the continent.
Yeah, they do. We're looking at things like actuaries, ICT systems analysts, nurses, security specialists, digital artists. It's a whole bunch of things. It brings to mind a couple of things. The one is briefly, partly in what yourself and Busi were talking about, the e-visa, but secondly, also the question of what regionalism actually means and whether we are willing to rethink our approach to skills and consider a regional or African continental skills bank as opposed to thinking competitively around how skills actually function. And I do think that if we consider that as a skills dividend rather than the inverse, which is a brain drain outwards, which is really what has been taking place, particularly in our health sector over the last 15 to 20 years. I think there are hundreds of thousands of South African nurses basically propping up the British National Health System as we speak, basically propping up many of the Middle Eastern, Qatar, Dubai health systems, and to a lesser extent Australia and Canada. So I think that in the reverse, we have to really rethink as a government whether or not we're willing to invest in skills which are going to automatically, or because of the working conditions, not be accessible to us as a country. And then in the reverse, what are the skills that are required for this economy? But it does seem to me quite bizarre that there is this inflow and outflow, and then at the very same breath, we talk about being a country which does not have the kind of skills dividend which is necessary to reach the kind of regional, international, whatever that may or may not mean, investment and economic strength and vibrancy that is necessary. And the final thing I'd like to say, that I've always thought that as a country, we need to be much more focused around what we want to be platforms in, what we want to be leaders in, what are the aspects of our knowledge economy that we would like to invest in, and what that dividend can look like in 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. And I'll give the example that I do enjoy of India, which in 1947, at the time of their independence, they had a far less dividend than ours, a huge population, and they made the decision that they're going to invest in maths and in science firstly, and in the cultural economy secondly. And I rest my case. There's Bollywood, and there are South Asian scientists across the world, basically running NASA, running most of the science and technology faculties across the US and across Europe. So we need to make those sorts of choices and then decide what is critical to us.
Okay. And that is where we're going to leave it. Thank you to all of you. Lebohang Peg, who is an economist with the Trade Collective, Professor Channing Ant, who is a director with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Busi Mavuso, who is the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. The Department of Social Development gazetted a green paper on comprehensive social security and retirement reform that would see South Africans pay up to 12% more tax on their income into a government-managed investment fund that would provide retirement, disability benefits, and unemployment benefits to all South Africans. On the 19th of August, Brenda Sibeko, a DDG in the department, was on this show explaining to us the process the department had followed and would still embark on regarding the proposed reforms.
We have gone through a whole lot of consultations within, the primary thing is within the NEDLEC platform, and even beforehand through the Taylor Committee when some of the original proposals were made. But it's important to say that what we've put together now has also gone through a second round of research and engagement, and we have refined some of the proposals, taking into account the input that came from the NEDLEC parties. But it's important also to say it's not the final picture. It's correct to say this is a discussion paper. It's the starting point at which we want to engage all of our South African citizens and hear what their views are about the kind of social security system that we can create in the country and how everyone in the country can be covered properly in a sustainable and reliable and affordable way for the country as a whole.
Well, notwithstanding that elaborate explanation, which is the understanding of everyone, that green paper was today withdrawn. It looks like there's more to it than meets the eye. We'll see. That's where we're going to leave it. Have a good night.